Hi, my name is Caroline Dromaguet, Director General of the Canadian War Museum. Welcome. The Canadian War Museum is Canada's National Museum of Military History. It is one of the world's most respected museums for the study and understanding of armed conflict. The museum is located in Ottawa, Ontario. I would like to acknowledge that the land on which the museum is located is on the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Canadian War Museum emphasizes the human experience of war throughout its galleries and in its programs. The Canadian Experience Galleries present the military history of Canada from earliest times to the present day, along with Canada's history of commemoration and remembrance. The museum's collection comprises more than 3 million artifacts, which are among the finest military holdings in the world. The collections include rare vehicles, small arms, uniforms, medals, unique archival material, and 14,000 works of art in the Beaverbrook collection of war art. Today, I'll take you on a unique tour to discover the fascinating objects and stories that we present. Along the way, we will meet a few of the experts that have worked on developing the content of our amazing exhibitions. Let's begin. The Canadian War Museum has a fascinating and symbolic architecture. The building, designed by Canadian architect Raymond Moriyama, reflects the concept of regeneration. The museum emerges slowly from the landscape, its grass-covered roof and low profile reminding us of nature's ability to recover from the devastation of human conflict. Concrete is the primary construction material, complemented by an expanse of glass windows and a copper-clad roof. Angled walls inside and out suggest the instability of war. The towering fin of Moriyama Regeneration Hall is pierced with windows spelling out the words, "Lest we forget, n'oublions jamais," in Morse code. The museum is environmentally friendly. River water is used in the museum's cooling systems. The eco-friendly green roof features low-maintenance self-seeding grasses. Several interior walls are faced with copper, recycled from the roof of the Library of Parliament. As soon as you walk in, the lobby sets the tone for the rest of your visit. The rough finishes of the walls evoke fortifications such as wooden palisades, stone fortresses, and concrete bunkers. The undulating floors and ceilings, as well as the sloping walls, suggest the destruction and instability of war. One notable feature is the green-gray copper covering several walls inside the museum. The copper was removed from the roof of Canada's Library of Parliament during renovations. Here at the museum, it reinforces the symbolic link between the museum and Parliament, the heart of Canada's democratic system of government.
Memorial Hall is one of the museum's most important and most visited locations. The tragic consequences of war are hard to comprehend. More than 115,000 Canadians died during the 20th century wars. Millions died worldwide in these same conflicts. Sometimes reflecting upon a single moment or story makes the enormity of war easier to grasp. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns of the First World War fell silent on the Western Front. Commemorating that moment, each November 11th at 11 a.m., here in Memorial Hall, the sun shines through a single, narrow window. Following the black line on the floor, the light illuminates the only object in Memorial Hall, the original headstone of the unknown soldier. In May 2000, the body of an unidentified Canadian soldier killed during the First World War was repatriated from France. The remains of Canada's unknown soldier were placed in a tomb at the National War Memorial in the heart of Ottawa, across from Parliament Hill. Without a name, this unknown soldier represents the sacrifice of all of Canada's fallen service personnel. On November 11th, the light shines on this headstone, a remarkably moving act of remembrance. Memorial Hall is a place for quiet contemplation of the many Canadians who have served Canada in times of war and conflict and who have paid the ultimate price.
Gallery 1 looks at all the wars where the fighting occurred in what is now Canada. It covers 5,000 years of history, from the first known conflict on the Pacific coast through Indigenous and colonial wars up to the last land battle fought in Canada in 1885. The gallery begins with a two-part definition of war. War is organized armed conflict, and war is a universal human experience. Why should war matter to Canadians? War matters because it has shaped Canada and Canadians for 5,000 years. You can't understand Canadian history or 21st century Canada without understanding war and its influence.
The first display examines how Indigenous peoples organized their communities for war, using a model of an Iroquoian community as an example. The community is fortified to defend against attack. To the right, hunting helps men train to work in groups, using the same weapons they would use in war. Boys trained to be warriors throw spears through a hoop. Women grow the corn that provides military rations and teach girls how to be farmers. To the left, the community is under attack. An enemy sets fire to the palisade. Men and women work to put out the fire. Outside the community, a battle is underway. Each side would first fire arrows at one another, then charge with clubs and attempt to take prisoners. Like European knights and Japanese samurai, many Indigenous warriors wore armor and helmets and carried shields. The mannequin, high up on the left, represents an Iroquoian warrior from what is now southern Ontario around AD 1500. His armor and helmet are made from wooden slats. For thousands of years, Indigenous warriors depended on armor such as this to protect themselves from thrown objects and handheld weapons. On two occasions, during the 1776 American Revolution and again during the War of 1812, the United States attempted to conquer Canada. Both attempts failed. This was because British soldiers, Canadian militia, both English and French, and Indigenous warriors came together to fight a common enemy. The bright red coat in the section of the War of 1812 belonged to Major General Sir Isaac Brock, who commanded the British forces in Upper Canada during the first year of the war. Brock was wearing this red coat at the Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13, 1812. Brock was killed leading a charge, but Mohawk warriors kept the Americans pinned down until reinforcements of British regulars and Canadian militia arrived, and the combined force overcame the invaders. Look closely at the chest of the tunic. The hole in the fabric is where Brock was hit by a musket ball. Every American invasion of Canada ended in failure, and Canada remained a British possession. But with the coming of peace between Britain and America, Indigenous peoples lost their power as military allies and found their lands and autonomy under increasing pressure from the Crown.
This gallery explores Canada's participation in the South African and First World Wars. Canadian efforts on the home front, combined with its official overseas commitments, fostered a new sense of nationhood, but at a great cost. The gallery explores Canada's role in the British Empire, especially the Canadian military contribution in the South African War of 1899 to 1902. When the First World War started in Europe in 1914, Canada, as a dominion of the British Empire, was automatically at war. Men, young and old, from across the country were keen to enlist. Most women were equally enthusiastic at the beginning of the war, and close to 3,000 served as nurses. A sense of adventure and excitement drove many Canadians to serve, while others believed in the justness of the war. Whatever led Canadians to don the uniform, the harsh reality of the Western Front was a wake-up call. Daily life was ruled by devastating machine gun fire, poisonous gas, and massive artillery barrages. Men and women in service and at home faced tremendous strain over the long and costly war effort. In this gallery, you can walk through a reconstructed trench and look through a periscope into a battle scene. There's also a digital map exploring the April 1917 Battle of Vimy Ridge. Throughout the gallery, there are moving stories of courage and sacrifice from Canadian soldiers, airmen, and nurses, as well as those who served on the home front. The terrible overseas losses, which eventually numbered over 66,000 killed, and the extremity of the war effort at home led to division and anger. Canada emerged from the First World War a grieving and divided country, but also victorious and with a new sense of pride.
During the First World War, families at home constantly worried about their loved ones serving overseas. One family's story is poignantly illustrated in this section. Lawrence Rogers was a 37-year-old farmer from Quebec when he joined the Canadian Mounted Rifles in 1915. Duty compelled him to leave his wife, 10-year-old daughter, and 7-year-old son. Even with an ocean separating him from his family, he maintained a connection with them, exchanging letters and keeping a small teddy bear that his daughter Eileen had sent. When Lawrence was killed at the Battle of Passchendaele in the fall of 1917, the soldiers emptying his pockets found the bear. Its legs had loosened over time from constantly being carried in his jacket pocket. The bear was returned, along with a letter from his son Howard that had arrived too late for Lawrence to read. These objects are reminders of the love and loss experienced by thousands of Canadian families during the First World War. This area represents the nightmarish landscape of mud, water, and death across which Canadians fought to capture Passchendaele Ridge in Belgium. This grim, costly struggle under appalling conditions is often seen as one of the First World War's most futile battles. Under Sir Arthur Currie, one of the war's leading generals, the Canadians prepared carefully to attack up the low, rain-soaked ridge, which was bristling with German defenses. After several weeks of hard fighting, the Canadians captured the village of Passchendaele in November 1917. It was a magnificent military achievement, but had cost nearly 16,000 killed, wounded, and missing. This part of the museum underscores the brutality of the First World War.
This gallery examines how Canada's fight against overseas dictatorship during the Second World War dramatically transformed the country and its place in the world. The gallery begins in the early 1930s with the introduction to the aggressive expansionist regimes of Germany, Italy, and Japan, and how Canada joined Britain and France in declaring war on Nazi Germany in September 1939, following the German invasion of Poland. Canada's involvement in the war was all-encompassing. More than 1 million men and women served in the military. Millions more were involved in war work, including agriculture, the extraction of natural resources, and the manufacturing of weapons and equipment. Canadians also volunteered their time and money in a range of ways to help support the war effort. Highlights in this gallery include Canada's military campaigns on land, at sea, and in the air, as well as wartime industries and daily life on the home front.
The Second World War wasn't just fought by military personnel at home and on oceans and distant battlefields. It was a total war that also involved ordinary people in cities, towns, and rural areas across Canada. Canadians were encouraged to ration and recycle. The war influenced everything, from people's clothing to children's toys. News of the war was everywhere, on the radio, in the movie theaters, in newspapers and magazines, and on propaganda posters. Wartime factories manufactured military equipment, from rifles and ammunition to aircraft, ships, and vehicles such as this Canadian military pattern truck. The need for war workers in Canada helped bring an end to the chronic unemployment of the Great Depression. Men and women flocked to industrial centers across Canada to work in factories, or worked in agriculture or extracting natural resources. As a crucial part of the workforce, women took on many jobs previously held by men. Canadians were also affected by wartime controls and shortages, including the wartime rationing of things such as fuel, sugar, and meat. Defeating Italy and Germany required the invasion of Western Europe. In July 1943, Canadian and Allied troops landed in Sicily, and later fought up almost the entire length of the Italian peninsula. In June 1944, they landed in Normandy, France. There are two separate sections in the gallery here. One section covers Canadian battles in Italy, including a reconstruction that evokes the house-to-house fighting in the town of Ortona. The other section covers the June 6 landings known as D-Day and the battles in Normandy that followed. Canadians landed on Juno Beach, one of 5 D-Day beaches. The section begins with a walk through the preparations for the invasion, followed by a recreation of a landing craft before exploring the Normandy campaign itself. After these two sections, the gallery follows Canadians fighting in Northwest Europe after the Normandy campaign, up until the liberation of the Netherlands, and also tells more of the story of those Canadians fighting against Japan.
This gallery examines how Canada became a respected international player through its commitments to Western defense and peacekeeping. Shortly after the Second World War, the Cold War began. It was a potentially lethal waiting game between the West and the Soviet Union. Each side watched the other's every move on every continent and prepared to unleash deadly nuclear weapons at the first sign of attack. To prepare for a potentially devastating war, Canadians made important military commitments during the Cold War. These included military alliances to project power overseas, to defend against threats at home, or to stabilize dangerous conflicts through United Nations peace support operations. The end of the Cold War, marked by the collapse of the Soviet Union and its allies, took the West by surprise. For a brief moment, the world seemed to be on the brink of a lasting peace. At the same time, however, simmering regional disputes in the former Yugoslavia, Africa, and Asia soon bubbled over into wars defined by ethnic nationalism, sectarian violence, and terrorism. Artifacts, eyewitness testimonials, and works of art connected to individual stories highlight how these missions have affected Canada and the world.
After the Second World War, Korea was divided into North and South. The Soviets established a well-armed communist regime in the North. The United States set up a shaky democracy in the South. Following years of tension, the North invaded the South on June 25, 1950. Backed by the United Nations, the United States led the defense of the South, and China joined the North. For 3 years, both sides fought a long and bitter war. Canadians strongly supported the United Nations, and Canadian troops were sent to Korea on land and at sea, supported by air power. Most of the Canadians fought on the ground with other United Nations forces. Canadians were frequently outnumbered by North Korean and Chinese forces. This model shows the Battle of Kapyong. In April 1951, soldiers of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry faced wave after wave of Chinese attacks. The battle was so intense that the only way to reach the unit with food and supplies was via airdrop. Surrounded and vastly outnumbered, the Patricias held their ground. 10 Canadians were killed and 23 were wounded. The Korean War ended on July 27, 1953, with the signing of the Korean Armistice Agreement. Although the war ended more than 60 years ago, the country is still divided and remains an international hotspot. This badly damaged vehicle, or what's left of it, shows the dangers Canadian soldiers faced while deployed to Afghanistan. It was one of Canada's longest and most intense overseas commitments since the end of the Cold War. Canada joined international efforts in Afghanistan as a result of the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the United States. 24 Canadians were killed in the attacks that day. Afghanistan's government, the Taliban, refused to turn over members of Al-Qaeda, the terrorist group claiming responsibility. As a result, the United Nations approved military intervention to force the Taliban out of power. Canada joined the initial mission in 2001 and remained to help provide security for Afghanistan's new government. In 2002 and from 2005 to 2011, Canadian soldiers were stationed in Kandahar province. Because the Taliban remained active in this province, Canadians were involved in combat operations over the 6 years that they were stationed there. On December 12, 2005, 3 Canadian soldiers and a journalist were on patrol in this Mercedes-Benz Geländewagen, or G-Wagon, in Kandahar province. They drove over an improvised explosive device, or IED, hidden in a dry riverbed. The blast threw the engine 7 meters, 23 feet, destroyed the front wheels and blew out the back tires. But the people inside were injured and survived, thanks to the G-Wagon's armor plating. Soon, Canadian soldiers faced bigger bombs that could destroy even more heavily armored vehicles. The G-Wagon is a symbol of the dangers that Canadians faced while serving in Afghanistan, and is an example of the type of destruction that an IED can cause.
This gallery explores Canadian traditions of remembrance, beginning with the early honoring of Indigenous warriors through burial, painting, and dance. The gallery moves through time to the creation of national monuments and the evolution of today's commemorative practices. The gallery is anchored by this spectacular scale model that served as a template for Canada's National War Memorial in Ottawa. It was designed by English sculptor Vernon March, who declared that the arch in the center is the gateway to peace. March died in 1930, leaving his 6 brothers and his sister, also artists, to finish the monument. The memorial, also known as the Response, stands in downtown Ottawa, and it was unveiled in 1939 by King George VI. It features a cascade of figures moving through the archway. These 22 figures represent a wide range of military personnel, including soldiers, nurses, a sailor, and a pilot. Atop the arch are 2 more allegorical figures, one representing peace, the other freedom. The National War Memorial was originally intended to recognize those who had served in the First World War, but it now honors the sacrifice of all Canadian Armed Forces personnel who have served in armed conflict. Moriyama Regeneration Hall represents the hope for a peaceful future in a space that combines spectacular architecture and moving works of art. The plaster figures in Moriyama Regeneration Hall were created by Canadian sculptor Walter Allward. They were used as models to build the imposing stone sculptures that adorn the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. The Vimy Memorial was erected by Canada to recognize the contributions of all Canadians who served in the First World War and to honor those who died there. The figures are symbolic. They represent charity, knowledge, hope, honor, justice, peace, sacrifice, and truth. On the upper floor, you can see one of the largest paintings in the museum's collection, Sacrifice by Charles Sims. Charles Sims' son died in the war, and this traumatic experience greatly influenced his art. In this work, the artist draws on the crucifixion to bear witness to Canada's war experience at home and abroad. For many soldiers of that time, the cross that cuts the painting represented the sacrifices made in battle. At the bottom of the canvas, there are scenes of mourning, but hope is also represented by images of a baby and a number of children. If you stand on the upper floor and look across Moriyama Regeneration Hall through the window at the rear, you can see the Peace Tower on Parliament Hill. In 1927, the Peace Tower was dedicated to Canadians who fought and died in the First World War. It expresses the desire for a more peaceful world.
The LeBreton Gallery is home to some of the museum's largest artifacts, ranging from artillery pieces to trucks and tanks. Most of the large artifacts here were used either by Canadians and their allies or against them. They show how, over time, human inventiveness has been applied to the science of war. Some vehicles and equipment in this gallery show how technology has evolved. Others remind us that their basic purpose, to attack or defend, hasn't changed. The artifacts on display are not inert hunks of metal, rubber, and wood, but represent tools used by hundreds of thousands of military personnel in war, peacekeeping, and peacetime. Some are closely tied to individual stories, while others help explain the scale and experience of industrialized warfare. The corridor leading to the LeBreton Gallery has several interesting features. The walls rise out of the floor at steep angles. The building has many angled walls, pitched from 3 to 30 degrees. This is one way the museum conveys the chaos and destruction of war. On the exterior wall, rectangular windows spell out the initials of the Canadian War Museum in Morse code, in both English and French. In Morse code, letters are represented by dots and dashes. Along the passage, there are several striking examples of Second World War nose art. At the end of the Second World War, Flight Lieutenant Harold H. Lindsay admired the nose art on a number of Halifax bombers awaiting scrapping. He suggested that the examples seen here be cut out and shipped to Canada. Each painting reveals something about the people who painted it and how they viewed their airplanes.
Thank you for joining me and my colleagues on this virtual visit of our museum. There is much more to discover. As you have seen, Canada is a country with a rich military history. You can extend your experience by visiting our website, where you will find online exhibitions, activities, detailed content about our various exhibitions, access to our collections, insightful blogs, and more. I hope to see you soon.